You're watching TV 20. We are Cleveland.
One of the things that always fascinated me were the mansions on Millionaires Row. And for those of you that may not be familiar, Euclid Avenue was known as the grandest avenue in all the world. And it was interesting who called it that, because I taught history and I never put this fella in Cleveland. And it was none other than Mark Twain, called Euclid Avenue the grandest, most beautiful avenue in all the world. And you might ask, well, how did Mark Twain know? I never put him in Cleveland. Well, he lived with a family that you might know called Severance. So if you've been to Severance Hall, it's one of the same. Mark Twain lived on the avenue with the Severances, and not only that, but he traveled with the millionaires on Millionaires Row throughout the world. So he saw the other great avenues, whether it was in London or Paris or Moscow. He concluded our Euclid Avenue, the grandest, most beautiful avenue in all the world. But what I became fascinated with, and it's even hard for me to get my arms around, in 1885, one half of the world's millionaires lived in Cleveland, Ohio at one time. One half. So we had the grandest avenue, and we had one half of the world's millionaires. This Cleveland was a pretty special place. And if you want to extrapolate, let's try to put one half of the world's billionaires in a city today. And I think we'd all see that it would be vibrant, cultural, fully employed, and imaginative. That was our Cleveland, Ohio. And so you can kind of see that the story's evolved in terms of making Clevelanders more proud. And there was no rhythm or rhyme to it. I thought from the beginning that Rockefeller kind of did not get the publicity that he deserved. Many Clevelanders are unaware that this was his home. This is where he made his fortune. And so I felt kind of strongly about that. Basically, he was born in upstate New York. He had two sisters and three brothers. Interesting family. His mother was a strict Baptist. Her name was Eliza Davidson. So when you hear John Dee, that's where the D comes from, the Davidson part of the family. And she was a strict Baptist, believed in frugality, believed in saving money, believed in the church. The Baptist church was basically her whole life. And from a young age, John Dee was taught charity, that you had to save no matter how little money you had. And she drove that into him. He began keeping diaries with all the money that he gave away for his entire life based on his mother. And his mother was a strict taskmaster. If he disobeyed her, he got smacked with a switch. And he talks about this, that his mother was no nonsense. One of the things that he learned early on was that he was working for an hourly wage, and he decided to raise some chickens. And he found out the chickens didn't take a lot of work, and he could sell them off at a big profit. And that stuck with him the rest of his life, that the fact that you don't necessarily have to do manual labor to become wealthy. But interesting now, you look at his father. His father, basically William Avery Rockefeller, was just the opposite. William Avery was a bigamist. So John Dee came from interesting family.
And I read that he was a little bit of a con man.
He was indeed a con man. He was known as a medicine man and called himself Dr. Rockefeller. And he sold potions in a little wagon all over New York. And interesting to note, these potions were supposed to cure everything from a hangnail to cancer. None of which worked, of course. But the little vials that he sold came from petroleum. I mean, the irony of history. The petroleum used to float up in the streams, and they would capture it, and it was like a lubricant. And so Dr. Rockefeller was selling oil well before his son became the biggest magnate in all the world. But they did migrate from New York early on. The Rockefellers migrated to Strongsville, Ohio. And there his father had relatives, and they stayed there. Now, the father was also, besides being a bigamist, was a horse thief. But he did love good horses, and he loved to dress. He was an impeccable dresser, all of which stayed with John Dee the rest of his life. He loved horses, and he dressed impeccably, no matter when you saw him. And while in Strongsville, he heard about a little high school called Central High School on the corner of East 9th and Euclid, if you can believe it, a little frame house. It was one of the first high schools in the United States. And it, by the way, it was the best high school in the United States, right here in little old Cleveland. So his father took two of the boys. There were three altogether, Frank, William, and John Dee. But he took William and John Dee, put them in a buckboard, and they drove in from Strongsville, put the two boys in a boarding house, and they went to Central High School. So with all the faults of the father, he believed in education. And that's, again, stuck with John D. Rockefeller the rest of his life. They eventually moved to Cleveland, and then the father was restless, moved back to Strongsville, actually Parma, and then eventually moved back to Cleveland. Because he was a bigamist, he was away from home quite a bit of the time. And so John Dee had great responsibility. And one of the stories that I love, John Dee was 16 years old. And the father definitely wanted to settle in Cleveland. He wanted a home for his family. And he turned to John Dee and he said, now keep in mind, he's 16 years old. And he said, I've set up an account and I want you to build the family home. Would you trust your 16-year-old? And according to his sister, Mary Ann, it was the best house they ever lived in. It was on Cheshire Street, which would have been about East 18th Street. And it was a brick home. Eliza, his mother, was very fond of it because of the roots and the neighborhood. And according to John Dee's sister, he was so fastidious that she thought the builder didn't make any money. He was there and he checked every little detail. But I was amazed at 16 years old that he pulled this off and was very successful. So again, and then he spent the majority of his adult life here in Cleveland.
But I mean, he was in business with his brother by age 20, correct? He actually formed the business with them about that age.
Correct. John Dee was really a millionaire before he got into oil. He was a bookkeeper by trade, and he did not graduate from Central High School. He left a couple months before graduation, and he went to Folsom School, which was a bookkeeping and accounting school, still the remnants still around today, and it was on Public Square. And John Dee knew to go into business, he needed to know bookkeeping and accounting. So he studied very, very hard. And initially, he wanted to go into business, so he formed a partnership with a Maurice Clark, a friend of his who was from Great Britain. And they were actually in the produce business. They were produce wholesalers, and they hit it perfectly because the Civil War was right around the corner. So they would buy train lots of produce and they would resell it. And John Dee was called Mr. Rockefeller around Cleveland when he was about 22 years of age. He was up and coming already. And many people had forgotten about that, that indeed he made his first fortune. What was interesting, and it shows you something about charity, John Dee, because he was taught by his mother to be charitable, was very active initially in the Boy Scouts. And there were two bankers, the two leading bankers in Cleveland, one of which was Truman Handy. And they were on the board of directors of the Boy Scouts. And they saw this young man being very fastidious and volunteering and working hard and not demanding a lot, and they observed this. Well, John Dee, to go into business, needed some money. He needed $2,000. So he went to his father, William Avery, and he said, sir, I'd like to go into business. And he was not quite 20, and William said, I was going to give you a trust fund of $1,000 when you turn 20, so I'll give that to you in advance. But what he was fond of saying to his son, and by the way, John, that'll be 10. By the way, John, that'll be 10. That means it was 10% interest. He wasn't going to give him the money, he was going to pay. And Rockefeller borrowed much money from his father over the years, but his father always showed up unexpectedly and demanded the loan to be paid off. So John Dee kept tons of money in the safe anticipating that his father may show up. But the rest of the loan is fascinating, came from the leading banker in Cleveland. He went to Truman Handy. And he went in, and Truman Handy recognized him and said, I've seen you've been very fastidious and volunteering, that you are very charitable. And so therefore, I'm going to give you this loan. And of course, they took collateral on the inventory that he had, which was quite natural. John D. Rockefeller, who never was emotional, that afternoon skipped all the way home singing that somebody actually gave him his first loan. And it gives you a little insight. I think what I'm fascinated with is when you look at the parents, you talk about opposites attracting each other. This would be a very unlikely pair. But the result was a young man who took from both of their parents, both the best venue from both parents, and became the richest man in the world.
Well, now, guys, richest man in the world. You have to understand, to this day, he is still considered the richest man that ever was. I mean, he actually, in his day, accumulated the equivalent of $350 billion. All right, so there's never been anyone in the world that's ever been this rich.
Basically, while he was in this wholesale food business, they began to ship oil from Pennsylvania. We may all remember from our history books that oil was found by Francis Drake in Pennsylvania about 1858. And John D. initially didn't like oil. He was wholesaling it. So they'd buy these greasy barrels of oil. They were in wooden barrels, and they always leaked. So it's not a good combination to have leaky oil and produce in the same warehouse. But he decided early on that that's not where the money was. The money was in setting up a refinery. So he got together with his partner, and they set up the first refinery. And interesting to note, John D. basically wanted to do more than just the refinery. But his partners were holding him back, and Maurice Clark had some brothers that John D. Rockefeller didn't like. So they had a meeting at the house that John D. built, and he was going to buy out Maurice Clark. And basically, the bidding got up to $78,000, which was a fortune back then. And Maurice bowed out, and John D. took over the oil business. Maurice kept the produce business. John D. gave that up. And early on, as he saw the ups and downs of the oil business, he decided that the best way to do this was to buy up refineries, that we had to consolidate. You know, we think we have depressions or recessions now. Back then, there was a recession every 3 or 4 years. And the prices would go up, and then they'd come down. And so he started in Cleveland buying up all the refineries, some from friends of his. You may remember a fellow by the name of Mark Hanna, who was the president builder here in Cleveland. And Mark Hanna had an oil well that John D. eventually bought. Mark Hanna, by the way, was a schoolmate of John D. at Central High School. So they knew each other from a very young age. Now, John D. became hated because basically he had a fellow by the name of McGregor. And McGregor was the guy that would go into the refineries and he'd put a value on them. And they said McGregor was so strict that he'd count the bristles on a broom. He counted everything. If a hose was in a box, he would take it out and measure the hose. And the people that were in refineries, because of the ups and downs, oftentimes were in debt, many thousands of dollars. And their refineries weren't worth equivalent to the debt. So John D. would go in, and they would always be disappointed at the value based on what McGregor came up with. And now he's a young man in his late 20s, talking to people that may have been my age, in his 60s and 70s, ready to retire. And so this young, snot-nose comes in, and he said, I'll tell you what, you take Standard Oil stock instead of the money, and you'll be a millionaire. Well, I don't know if I would take the stock based on what I know today. You're a little more conservative when you get to retire. But those that did became millionaires. Those that didn't hated John D. Rockefeller. And oftentimes it was the wives who said, you cannot do this. What does this young guy know? He's a young fellow. He doesn't know anything. And then, of course, when the others became millionaires, the wives would turn to their husbands and said, you dumb dodo, you should have taken the stock. And then John Dee went to other states to do the same thing. And he became a monopoly. Standard Oil at one point was refining 90% of the world's petroleum. 90%. And they became, of course, the big corporation of the world. They were known as the Standard.
Exactly. I mean, that's why it was $350 billion he was worth it at his peak. And it was from refining, not buying. I mean, he wasn't pumping oil. It was all refining.
I think the greatest myth maybe is that he was uncharitable. And this, obviously, as we talked, is not the truth. One of the things that's interesting is that he was a billionaire, and he wound up giving away $1.5 billion. Now, interesting to note, what he actually gave away was $500 million. But when he gave it away, he gave it in Standard Oil stock. And so the stock went up threefold. You know, wouldn't we love to have in our retirement account today stock that went up 50% every year and paid a 10% dividend? This was Standard Oil. So some of the myth was, well, he didn't give as much money away as he might. He did. He gave away over $500 million.
In essence, he almost also, with all this money, invented he invented that industry. He invented how to give the money back. I mean, I don't know how much you studied about it, but I was kind of fascinated by the fact that he is credited with inventing how very rich people can give the money back.
Yeah, that's true. Basically, with all his ups and downs in business, and if you read about John D. Rockefeller, there was a period of time late in life when he was in his 50s. There was a gal by the name of Ida Tarbell who wrote for McClure's magazine. That would be the equivalent of Time magazine, I suppose, today. And she hated Rockefeller because she said that basically he took advantage of her dad, and he was one of the guys that took the cash rather than the stock. And so she wrote these horrible articles about him. And in fact, she even came to Cleveland. John Dee was a strict Baptist, and his church was on the corner of Euclid and East 9th Street. And she mocked him of his appearance. Now, John Dee, of all the things, was impeccable at his appearance. And they put this caricature on the front cover that drove him crazy. They made him look like a monster. And of all the things that she said, no matter how nasty, it was that picture that drove him crazy. But he never had a nervous breakdown. With all of this, he became the most hated man in the world. And in fact, he had to hire Pinkerton guards to guard his house and his estate because he was afraid of kidnapping of his family. So the richest man in the world couldn't leave his estate because of all these threats. And this continued for a number of years, but he held up until such time as he contracted a disease, which most people are unaware of, called alopecia. And that means he lost every hair on his body. His mustache began falling out, and his wife said he began to notice this. And it happened very quickly, over 2 months. And his doctor, Dr. Hamilton Bigger, who was his personal physician and was head of Huron Road Hospital, tried to work, but there was nothing you could prescribe. Even today, alopecia, I believe, is not curable. So you may wonder, you see John D. Rockefeller with this wonderful head of hair. Those were all wigs. He was totally bald by age 60. But he realized that as part of his breakdown, he was becoming overwhelmed with requests to give out his wealth. So he sat down and he just decided to give away his wealth, much like he built his business on the same principles. And he hired a fellow by the name of Gates, who was a Baptist, and John Dee, of course, sided with Baptists. And they put together a model. And the requests basically were looked upon that whatever they invested in had to have almost national or worldwide impact. So if you were poor and you needed $1,000, you were not eligible. They looked at big projects. And one of the things that we kind of forgot about here in Cleveland, I think, Rockefeller, I don't think gets the recognition that he deserves. What did he leave here in Cleveland that most of us forgot about? Well, we have Rockefeller Park, by the way. He donated that whole thing. And he hired a wonderful architect, Charles Schweinfurth. If you've ever been on Martin Luther King Boulevard and go under those wonderful bridges, Those were all done by Charles Schweinfurth, who built the Mather Mansion and Trinity Cathedral as well. Rockefeller, though, his great vision was that he just didn't donate the land. He came up with a foundation so that 100 years later, there would still be money to support the project, whether it was the greenhouses or the park.
That's what I was talking about, that he invented a way, he basically invented the foundation approach to making sure it would be taken care of forever.
Yeah, and interesting question. We look at our Severance Hall, which is John L. Severance. You know, Rockefeller doesn't get any credit for Severance Hall. You know, Severance Hall is all Rockefeller money. Most people forgot about that. Where did Severance get his money from? Standard Oil. Severance's cousins and uncles were Standard Oil. When, by the time John Dee was a little older and they were building Severance in the late 20s, early 30s, John L. Severance came up with $1 million. And he said, you've got to raise $3 million before I'll donate. And this was quite common. And this is what Rockefeller invented. He never put all the money into a project. It had to be matched or tripled. And Rockefeller was already out of charge. His son, Junior, John D. Rockefeller II, was contacted by a gal by the name of Adela Prentice, who was the founder of the orchestra. And she wrote a letter to John D. Jr. and said, Severance is going to come up with $1 million. Would you be willing to donate? And he said, no, I won't donate to the project, but what kind of trust fund have you set up? And she said, well, we're trying to raise another $2 million for a trust fund. And Junior came up with $250,000 to put into that trust fund, which is still in existence today to support our orchestra. So John Dee encouraged, by the way he did things, additional donations. That was kind of some of the genius, the way he did things. And people knew they had a base to come from. And by the way, Adela Prentice was very famous and gave music lessons to John D. Rockefeller's children. So that was a perfect tie-in, and she's well known in Cleveland as founding the orchestra. By the way, it's interesting, the orchestra started out at Gray's Armory, and then they migrated to Masonic Temple, and then in the 1930s migrated to our absolutely beautiful Severance Hall. John Dee loved golf. And many people forgot about this. He had his 9-hole golf course at Forest Hill. And Cyrus Eaton was his caddy. And he said he learned more being a caddy with 4 hours of golf than he ever learned in business. Because John Dee basically would talk business. Now, he had a sense of humor. As I said, his doctor was Dr. Hamilton Bigger. And Dr. Bigger was a member of John Dee's famous foursome. He had 4 guys, much like we play golf today, that he played with quite often at Forest Hill. And John Dee wanted to live to be 100. In fact, Bigger and John Dee were born in the same year. They were both the same age. And he said, Doctor, tell me what do I need to do to live to be 100 years old? And he said, you and I will go on this special diet. Dr. Bigger was a homeopathic doctor and believed in fresh air and vegetables. And oh, great news, but kind of what we're doing today. And so John Dee went on this diet, part of which was barley milk and water for some reason. Now, sadly, Bigger died when he was 87. John Dee wanted to play golf on their 100th birthdays. And John Dee was a little upset that his doctor didn't live to play golf on the 100th birthday. So he had a sense of humor. He basically played golf till he was 93. And he died, of course, he was just short of his 98th birthday. And later on when he played golf, he was a celebrity. And of course, hundreds of photographers would show up. This is in his reclining years in the 20s and early 30s. And he didn't walk the golf course. He basically rode his bicycle. But he didn't ride his bicycle. He had somebody pushing his bicycle for him. And he had a kind of a menagerie of people around him. One person was in charge of holding the umbrella over his head. Another was assigned to yell, keep your head down, every time he took a shot. And another was in charge of chalking the club, and this was so he could tell how he hit the ball off the face of the club. And the reporters used to marvel at this kind of stuff. There's a cute story, I think, that gives you more insight into John D. Rockefeller than anything else I can tell you. And he did not start out as the first golfer in his family. He actually built the golf course, as folklore suggests, for his wife, Seti. And her name was Laura Spellman. He called her Seti. She was a wonderful gal. And she loved golf, and she had a sister, Lucy, that lived with them her whole life. Lucy had never gotten married. And so Lucy and Seti played on the golf course that John Dee built. It was a 9-hole golf course. And every morning they would tee off, and by the way, they didn't walk. Seti had the first electric golf cart at the turn of the century. And you can imagine they didn't have golf clothes back then, so they're dressed in black long skirts, all their jewelry and their hats, trying to play golf. And after 3 holes, they'd get tired, and they would go to the tee house for tea. And John Dee kind of observed this. And he watched, but he liked to be bicycling, he liked to be walking, he liked to be chopping wood. He loved to move trees all over the property, dig up big trees and move them. But you remember I said at one point he was the most hated man in all the world. And I think we might agree that no matter what kind of great marriage you have, this had to take its toll on their marriage. And over the years, Seti had such great respect for John D. Rockefeller, she was fond of saying that my husband can do anything. And apparently he hadn't heard this for a while, and again, he's getting beat up, and he's being sued all over the place, and the pressure had to be immense. And I think he felt that he hadn't heard Seti say for a while, my husband can do anything. Now, he kind of felt that maybe she had lost confidence in him. And after 40 years of marriage, I think he wondered, well, did she still love me? And I think all of us that have been married for long periods of time might have that question on our mind. Does she still love me? Does she still respect me? Now, you would think the most powerful man in all the world, with the most money in all the world, would just go up to his wife and say, by the way, do you still love me? Well, those of you that have been married a long time, try it. It's not an easy thing to do. I think you might have fear of the answer. So John Dee decides to impress Seti. And he thought the best way to do that is to learn to play golf secretly and surprise her. And this, again, gives you some insight into his character. So there's a fellow by the name of Joe who was the club pro at an old club called Lakeshore Country Club. And Rockefeller contacted Joe and paid him $5 an hour to secretly come out to Forest Hill to teach him golf lessons. And nobody knew about it. It was at the crack of dawn. And by the way, $5 an hour back then was a huge amount. So John Dee really was anxious to learn to play golf. And he also pioneered another thing with golf. He hired a plain dealer reporter to take pictures of his golf swing, which we all do today on videotape to find out where the club is located. And all summer he took lessons and he got quite good. And now the big day comes. He's going to surprise Seti. And so Seti and Lucy are out, they're ready to tee off, and they've got the menagerie of caddies and umbrellas and all the things that they did. And John Dee walked up and he said, give me your club, I'm going to show you how to play golf. Now the ladies knew he had never touched a golf club. And they began laughing hysterically. This man cannot possibly teach us anything. My wife says that quite often with my golf game. And after it simmered down, you can picture John Dee standing there stoically waiting for it to simmer down. And he put a club in his hands and they were puzzled. For the way he touched the club was absolutely tremendous, like he had touched it all his life. And he asked for a ball and he put it on the tee and he hit it straight down the fairway. And the women were speechless. And from that day forward, Seti said, my husband can do anything, even playing golf, without one lesson.
Fantastic.